Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Conspiracy Crunch. My name is Aaron Chandler, and we are back for our second episode. Last week, we discussed the Philadelphia experiment, which was a American US Navy boat that was allegedly turned invisible and teleported during an experiment. That episode is now available on YouTube, and we did a little poll on our Facebook page to see people's reactions and to see if you believe the story yourself, actually. And it came out of interesting results. Apparently 67% of you don't believe in the Philadelphia experiment, which is quite interesting because I was expecting it to be a little more even than that, but 2/3 is quite an overwhelming majority, I would say, and that is definitely interesting. You'll notice there is a significant absence on the show today, and that is because Abby is sadly feeling unwell. Plan is she will be back as usual next week for our show, which is going to be about Kapustin Yar, which is essentially the Soviet Union's equivalent of Area 51. There is also a poll on the Facebook page to decide what next week's subject topic is going to be. The second subject, that is. It is between whether Alexander the Great was actually murdered by his own army, or if there is a secret room hidden beneath the Sphinx of Egypt. At the moment, the Sphinx is absolutely annihilating Alexander the Great on that poll. I think it's 81% to 19% on that. It's stupidly ridiculously winning that one. This week's show, compared to last week, it's going to be a lot more linear today because it's just me. If you tuned in last week, you'll know that Abby was here, and there's a lot more discussion based. It was more sort of informal. It was a lot more conversation based. So this week is going to be a lot more linear. It's going to be me talking to you. And I mean, talking for an hour straight is a lot. So there will be little pauses here and there where I'm sort of trying to stop my mouth from drying out from talking so much. Yeah, welcome to the show. And if you've been following us on Facebook, you will know what today's subjects are. Of course, we have got the Rohonc Codex for the third body whatsoever. I did have a potential co-host lined up, but not even they had heard of it. So it's quite interesting that that so few people know about this. It's quite exciting, and to my knowledge, this is going to be half-hour coverage on the Rohonc Codex. When I upload this to YouTube, this is going to be the single longest video about the Rohonc Codex on YouTube. The longest one's currently about 10 minutes, so this is definitely going to be interesting. As I was saying, the Rohonc Codex is a mysterious book discovered in 1838. It was found when Count Gustav Bathyany donated his entire library to the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. Now, last week there were a lot of names to remember. This week won't be so bad, but there is one you have got to keep note of. Count Gustav Bathyany is where the start of this conspiracy theory comes from. And now, like I said, he donated his entire library of books, which was a lot of books, to the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. So it was discovered, as you would suspect, in Hungary, considering it is donated to the Hungarian Academy of Sciences by a Hungarian man. You would probably suspect that. But the book is amazingly 448 pages long and includes 87 illustrations. That may just seem like a normal book to you, but let's go into more details on that. The illustrations depict famous religious imagery from Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism. What makes it so fascinating is it is written in an unknown language that most closely resembles Old Hungarian, and some suggest there may even be resemblance of ancient Hindi. Again, this is very interesting. Sort of, in today's computer age, there's not much that we don't know and that we can't translate, especially if it's written down on paper and is black and white physical evidence like we've got in this situation. Yeah, computers haven't been able to translate it. And it gets even more interesting because there are 10 times the amount of letters and symbols in the Rohonc Codex in any known language. It's any known language. It's not just Old Hungarian. There's 10 times that. It's a staggering amount of symbols in this book. And it's so mysterious as well. When first discovered, it was estimated to be from the medieval era, but the watermark on the paper has been dated from between the years 1529 and 1540. Even today, its origins, purpose, and author, or authors, as we are undecided on that, is unknown. Dozens, possibly hundreds of scholars have studied it, and yet nobody can even begin to translate it. Like last week with the Philadelphia experiment, we had the cultural interest of that one, and we're going to be delving into that for the Lost City of Atlantis as well. But to my knowledge, actual sort of fictional basis off of the Rohonc Codex is very thin on the ground, almost non-existent, you could argue, which is quite interesting because this is quite a fascinating subject as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, it seems strange that no one's picked up on it before. We do this for every feature. We've now got the big questions that we're going to try and answer during the next 23 minutes we've got left on this subject. So first of all, we've got who wrote it. This is a big question. This is one that we will potentially never know because obviously there's no name on there, it's not signed, there's nothing like that at all. Why was it written? There's big questions about this because like at the time, the religions mentioned in it were generally conflicting, and given the friction between them, it was interesting to see what kind of person would have given them equal exposure and equal footing and ground and stature, I suppose, in this kind of format at that time. It is very interesting. And where was it written as well? Although it was discovered in Hungary and potentially written in Old Hungarian, the other religions being there involved in it does make it quite interesting as well. Like, we can't be entirely certain as to where it originally came from, but we will go into that more in detail as we go further into the show. Like I said, we've got the history so far. So 1838 is a key year, you've got to remember, and then 1529, 1540 for the watermark. They're the big things you've got to remember so far, and the big religious stuff. So make a note of that. If you're taking notes, using this for research of your own or whatever, or you can just sit back and enjoy the show as well if you like, and sort of come here with an open mind is what I would suggest. If you come here going, oh, it's all rubbish, then you're not going to enjoy it. If you come in with an open mind and you don't believe it afterwards, that's fine. I mean, not even I personally believe all of the conspiracies that we present on the show here. It's definitely worth approaching them with an open mind. Like, think how rubbish my research would be if I just wrote it's all a load of rubbish on my notes and I'd have to try and stretch it out for half an hour. It just wouldn't work, would it? So yeah, come in with an open mind and just see what happens, really. You might end up believing it, so who knows? Anyway, I have outlined 4 big popular theories about the writing in the Rohonc Codex. So we're going to go on to that now. The first theory of these is called the Brahmi Hindi hypothesis. Now, you can probably understand where this one's leading from the name. I mentioned that people have suggested that it has links of ancient Hindi in the writing, and that comes from this particular theory we're going to look at now. This theory says that Rohonc Codex is a variation of religious Brahmi script in India and should be read left to right. Now, that is an interesting theory because scholars who have studied the Rohonc Codex have sort of widely and generally accepted the idea that the Rohonc Codex was written right to left. So, like, for example, here in the Western world, we write left to right. We can tell that by studying text, and when we write, on the right-hand side of the margin, if there's a word that overlaps down onto the next line, it leaves a bit of a gap at the end, right? That is what has been not observed in the Rohonc Codex, basically. Yeah, it's been right to left is the hypothesis on the Rohonc Codex's writing, because where we have the marginal gaps on the right-hand side of the page from writing left to right, the Rohonc Codex has it on the other side of the page, which is signalling that it was written in a different form of Cyrillic, basically. Yeah, it seems interesting to me, but I'm probably dragging this bit out a little too much. But anyway, he suggested that it should be read from left to right as opposed to the widely accepted right to left theory from scholars. So the founder of the theory is named Mukesh Kumar Singh. That's a bit of a mouthful if you say that quickly. So Mr. Singh we shall go for this one. So Mr. Singh claims to have translated the first 24 pages into Hindi and claims it is initially a gospel followed by a meditative prologue. Now that's a difficult one to say quickly, never mind his name. And then it's stories of Jesus' infancy. In other words, he's basically hypothesizing that the Rohonc Codex is a catalogue of religious beliefs from the 1500s. This is a very interesting idea. Right, this raises the question to us saying, well, why would, in a period of religious turmoil like that, where religions weren't really coinciding, they weren't collaborating as they are today in multicultural societies, why would it be that someone would take something as valuable as paper in the 1500s as well? Remember, not everyone could read and write at this point still. It was still mainly monks and scholars that were exclusive to that and privately educated people, politicians also. And it seems weird to think that someone would take something as valuable as a knowledge in writing and reading and something as valuable as paper and use it in such a diverse manner for the time. It is really baffling to sort of suggest that and understand where it came from. But the Singh's suggestion is that because it had Jesus' infancy and a meditative prologue got it at that time, it's sort of that automatically shows the range of ideas that are in there, because meditation isn't normally associated with things like Christianity. It's more of a Hindu thing, it's more of a Buddhist thing. Yeah, there you go, a sort of a little food for thought there as your initial part of this theory, because however there are some issues with it. There's Singh was criticised by experts for lacking consistency with his translations, and some historians even called his translation a hoax, which I think it might be a little bit harsh, but who knows, maybe it is a hoax. It is interesting though that he claims to have translated the first 24 pages, which is a big portion of the book. You think that's about 5% of the book, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that's 24 pages than pretty much every other person that's ever looked at it is translated between them. So 24 pages is a big chunk of it. It seems a little too good to be true that he unlocks it so easily by just going, oh, maybe it's this language. And also on top of this, you've got it's based off of a variation of Brahmi script from India. It is found in Hungary from a Hungarian count, written in a Cyrillic that resembles Old Hungarian. If anything, that the similarities of India is probably quite far strained. Anyway, that's a little side note for you there. Let's get back onto it. The left to right idea mostly rejected due to the margin gaps, as I mentioned earlier. But yeah, he was criticised by experts who had also studied it for the lack of consistency with his translations. In other words, he took too many liberties with his translations. Like sometimes he would derive it from Latin, and then he would take it from the script it's in Hindi, or Old Hungarian as it was, transcribe that into Latin, then back into Hindi. So symbols ended up with, like one symbol would end up with multiple translations of the same word. For example, there's I can't show you obviously because it's radio. I might put a picture of it on the YouTube actually, but on the YouTube upload. But there's basically a symbol in the Rohonc Codex which is like a circle of dots and like a sideways S inside of it. It kind of resembles a symbol for clouds in Mayan literature, which is, I think that's coincidental because that symbol appears quite frequently in this book. And also at the time in the 1500s, you hadn't actually rediscovered Mayan culture in a sense. So that is another point. It's probably unlikely there's a link with Mayan culture, but that's sort of what that symbol looks like. That sort of dotted circle with the S, that had multiple translations from him. And it could basically be read to say whatever he wanted it to, in a sense. So because of that, Mukesh Kumar Singh's theory has been almost unanimously rejected by people involved with research into the Rohonc Codex. So that's your first hypothesis. Our second one is one we have touched on a little bit already in that last one. It is the Old Hungarian hypothesis. I couldn't find the name of the person who founded this theory. There's a lot of names associated with it, and there's no real way of sort of pinpointing it to one particular person. So I've just decided to not name any of them, and because I feel like it's fair, I don't want to name someone who ended up not being where it is founded from and getting called out for it. So I'm going to play it safe, say that we don't actually know the direct origin of this theory. But past that, the Old Hungarian hypothesis is one scholar suggested that the text is derived from Old Hungarian and revolves around the topics of the New Testament. This is another interesting one because the illustrations in the book, obviously we can't read it because we can't translate it, but the illustrations in there clearly depict religious battles and like religious imagery from different religions. Like there's one of Jesus being crucified, and then there's another one which is seemingly like a head or a face coming out of the clouds down to people. It's very interesting looking at some of these illustrations. It relates to the New Testament, is the theory of the Old Hungarian hypothesis. But again, the issue with this is If you cross-reference it with Sing's, that means only one of these can be right at best, because he suggests that there's meditation prologues in there as well. And obviously Christianity wouldn't have that, to my knowledge. That wasn't a big thing in Christianity at the time. Also, that is more Hindu related as well. So you've got that. And if it was New Testament, you probably wouldn't expect to see stuff about Hinduism, and especially Islam, in there. Although issues stump this theory as well, because it includes imagery from other religions such as Islam, which I mentioned. I mean, the New Testament theory is at least partly wrong. As I previously stated, it's I don't know where this theory came from, really. It seems like, I think it's probably the weakest out of the four that I'm going to mention. It doesn't really allow for the fact that there's other religious imagery and illustrations present in the book, which would eliminate the New Testament. And on top of that, if it was solely a New Testament purpose book, then surely the Rohonc Codex's actual existence would be undermined by, well, the Bible. Surely, because if the Rohonc Codex is just a unique illustration of the Bible, then why not just get a Bible? Because it's going to tell you the same stuff. It's just got different illustrations in there, and you've written it in some crazy language and no one can read anyway. So what would the purpose be at that point? How would you come to a conclusion off the back of that? So then after that, we have the Sumero-Hungarian hypothesis, which is another interesting one. In 1996, Hungarian theorist Attila Nyíri, I've probably brutalised the pronunciation of that one, so I apologise to any Hungarian people listening. I probably just offended you greatly by saying something I shouldn't have in Hungarian. But Attila Nyíri turned the pages upside down to identify what he perceived to be Sumerian ligature. This is a language from the ancient Sumer people who lived in the 3rd millennium BC in what is now modern-day Iraq. So again, this is a very interesting development in theories on the Codex. So this means the Codex would draw from influences much older than anyone had ever thought. It's much, much older. Originally, people were saying that it was from the 1500s, like 1529 to 1540 is the watermark, like we mentioned. Suddenly, this idea that the 3rd millennium BC is over, so that's like 4,500 years older than anyone was originally suggesting. It's much, much. Of course, the book isn't from that period because it's made of paper. It wouldn't last that long. It would just deteriorate. It would be unreadable, if not non-existent at this point, if it was that old. The idea it gets influence from such an old, stems from such old influence is quite strange, and it begs questions as to how the author knew about the Sumer people at that time, how he was an expert in Sumerian ligature, and also why it was written upside down. Again, much like with the previous hypothesis I mentioned, there is a downside, as he associated some letters to Latin, and the same symbol was sometimes given multiple different translations. See, this is a recurring problem, the translations of the Rohonc Codex. People attempting to translate it cannot cope with the immense amount of symbols in the book. The same word gets associated to different symbols, and the same symbol gets associated to different words, meaning that it can be mumbled and sort of it's just it becomes an absolute mishmash and a mess of a translation, and it can essentially be redone to say whatever you want it to say, really. A shame that it's so difficult to translate this, because there could be so much hidden knowledge in this book. But Nyíri was basically criticised for taking too many liberties, in his translation, meaning the Codex could be interpreted to say whatever you want it to. It was selective reading, basically. He could pick and choose bits that he liked and associate a word to a symbol and a symbol to a word to make a sentence, and then be like, yeah, there's my translation. But he's essentially made it up with some loose referencing, if you will. And the fourth and final issue, or the hypothesis, I should say, is that it is actually a hoax. Now, this is quite an interesting one, because there's no doubt that the Rohonc Codex actually exists. You can go and see it. It's in a museum. It's in the Hungarian Museum of Sciences. You can go and look at it. It's a real thing. We're not denying that, but the denial is its authenticity and its legitimacy as an actual real document. A Hungarian historian, Karoli Sazbo. Oh, we've got some great names on this one for pronouncing. I kind of wish Abby was here for this episode, just so I could get her to say all of the difficult names, and then I can focus on the rest of it. But we've got Karoli Sazbo is the name here. Suggested that the book was a hoax created by Samuel Literati Nemes. So this man lived from 1796 to 1842, which just so happens to elapse the discovery of the Rohonc Codex in 1838. Of course, that was more towards the end of Nemes's life, but as you can see, he was only 46 years old when he passed. It's not like he would have been struggling with old age or anything at the time. Samuel Nemes was an antiques expert who was renowned for forgeries of artifacts and historical pieces throughout the 1830s. So you've got the right person in the right place at the right time. It seems like it's all adding up quite nicely there for that one. Then again, there are some more issues here. So the theory was made in 1866, which is a long time ago now, that goes without saying. And since then, science has advanced considerably, allowing us to accurately date the watermark on the pages, like I mentioned earlier, from 1529 to 1540. Also, the paper the Rohonc Codex is written on is estimated to be Venetian paper from the 1530s. It's all adding up. It's quite consistent there with the age of the paper. Of course, that doesn't guarantee that the actual writing on the page is that old. It is a possibility that Nemes did somehow manage to acquire 300-year-old Venetian paper from somewhere and then wrote a book on it and hoaxed it. But the likelihood of him finding nearly 500 pages of unused 300-year-old paper with very pristine watermarks on, all in the same place, is extremely unlikely, near impossible, you could argue. And on top of this, there is no evidence to suggest a link of any kind between Nemes and the Rohonc Codex. So the likelihood of this being, I'm not saying it isn't a hoax, but the likelihood it was hoaxed by Samuel Nemes is extremely low. So that was all the hypothesis surrounding the book. I hope you've all soaked that in. And now we're going to move on to the unusual theories and conspiracies surrounding the Rohonc Codex. There's some real wacky ones in here, some big left field theories, so strap in for this. So the book contains imagery from Hinduism, Islam and Christianity, as we have previously discussed, which leads some people to believe that the text was created in a place where these three religions coexisted. The issue with this is predating the 1500s, and within the 1500s also, there was no recorded society such as this to have ever existed. At the time, Islam was present in the Ottoman Empire, which is now modern-day Turkey, and partly in other Eastern European states. Hinduism was present in India as it is today, and Hungary, along with most of Europe, was Roman Catholic. So these three religions don't elapse at any point in that period. On top of that, you've got the earliest recording of split religions in Hungary came from 1555, when Hungary Bohemia became a reformed Protestant partly. Hinduism has never been a predominant religion in Hungary. So we've got issues there of the knowledge of how a Hungarian scribe or monk, depending on who wrote this, would have had knowledge of a sufficient knowledge of Hinduism or Islam to present it in this book. Is also, again, the question is still present, why would he anyway at this period of time? If he was like a devout Christian monk, he would not be willing to open people's minds and ideas to other religions. He would want to keep it very Christian, very Roman Catholic in that sense. And on top of that, the splitting of Hungary's religion was in 1555. The book was written in the 1530s, so that's already 25 years predating, which means it can't have happened then either. This leads people to believe that perhaps it was written in a place where these three religions actually did coexist. But like I said, no official place of that exists, which leads on to the big conspiracy theory that a place of this kin, for example, would have been written out of history. I do struggle to believe this one personally. Like the idea that you could write an entire society out of history is quite overwhelming and quite a remarkable feat if you consider it, because there's going to be lots of people involved, lots of scriptures, lots of culture, lots of architecture, for example, and the idea that they could just eradicate that is quite difficult, I think. It is slightly more unlike, I'd say the hoax is more likely than this. I mean, you can't rule it out undeniably at the same time. And then we can move on to, so past that, that's the original theory that I think is quite strange. After that, we have going back to one of our main questions on where was it written. We have got, it may have been written in the Ottoman Empire. Like I mentioned, this was predominantly Muslim at the time. And this isn't a particularly likely source, but it's certainly more plausible than other suggested sources, such as the fact it was written about a society that's been written out of history. The Ottoman Empire is where active religions from West Asia and Europe met, meaning it would have been a point between Hinduism and Christianity while remaining a Muslim state in of itself. So that's quite interesting. The Ottoman Empire was probably the most likely basis from which it could have been written. It would have people like merchants and traders passing from Europe to India and vice versa. Ottoman traders would be travelling either way as well. So there is that mixed area as well, which would make it likely a source for where the book came from. All three featured religions in the Codex could have passed through, and maybe the book was written as a collaboration between important figures from their respective religions, supporting the idea that it was written by a Hungarian monk or a scribe, but this time in collaboration with representatives from Ottoman Islam, Hindu, India. So perhaps this could also have included a Hungarian Christian scribe, but who would have taken the book back to Hungary with him. Unless the book was written solely by a Hungarian, however, the languages of Islam and Hindu would also have featured. But again, studies show that it is most likely written by just one person and in one language. Also, Christianity was allowed in the Ottoman Empire, but had to be kept as a minority figure in comparison to Islam. Meaning if it was written in the Ottoman Empire as a collaboration, then a Muslim representative probably would have kept them in the Ottoman Empire, unless the Hungarian monks stole it. We can't really guarantee how that would have worked. Like I just said, the Ottoman Empire, or we'll say Turkey now, as it's Ottoman Empire is quite a mouthful. I mean, we nearly finished the Rohonc Codex section anyway, so you might as well keep saying Ottoman Empire. Basically, it would have stayed in Turkey if it was written in the Ottoman Empire, because Islam had the priority over other religions. So, like I said, unless it was stolen or smuggled out, or a Hungarian wrote it about Islam with help from someone without their knowing, like it's like a secret blog or something, I guess would be the modern day equivalent. Another interesting theory. Yeah, a lack of mentioning of the Greek Orthodox Church. Okay, a little bit of background information on that. The Greek Orthodox Church was present within the Ottoman Empire, but it was scrutinised very closely throughout its existence within the Ottoman Empire. A lack of its mentioning also strengthens the idea in the Codex because, like I said, the Ottoman Empire scrutinised the Greek Orthodox Church very closely, and they would not have allowed exposure of it. And there is no mention of this, to our knowledge, in the Rohonc Codex, which means that it could well have been written in the Ottoman Empire, and then the Greek Orthodox Church was written out of history in this instance, if you will. And our one final point before we conclude the Rohonc Codex and the first half of this episode is the most left field theory you're going to hear on the show today. Is it came from an alternate reality. Yeah, you heard me right. Easily the strangest Rohonc Codex theory of all is the suggestion that the book is written in an ancient language from an alternate reality. This comes from similarities of some letters in the Rohonc Codex to the Voynich manuscript, which is an equally puzzling book that originates also from the 15th century. No, wait. That would be the 1400s. Never mind. Okay, so it's from the 15th century, but the Rohonc Codex is the 16th century. Just clear that up now. More outspoken theorists suggest that both Voynich manuscripts and the Rohonc Codex came from a parallel reality where there are similar religious teachings but different ancient languages. Obviously, there's no way of us proving this. Like, it links into the Mandela effect a little bit of this idea of passing through realities without knowing and coming back with information from that alternate reality that we remember as truth, but actually isn't. For example, the Bearstein Bears is the famous Mandela one. A lot of people remember it as the Bearstein Bears, but that's the Mandela effect. And perhaps the Rohonc Codex and the Voynich manuscript are the only physical evidence of the Mandela effect in our reality, and we just haven't realised yet. That is it for the Rohonc Codex today. I hope you enjoyed that little bit. This like I said, today's a very linear show. It might be quite dense in terms of the terms of the dialogue. I apologise for that, but there's not a whole lot I can do about it because I'm here by myself today. Next week, like I said, we will be back up to our full numbers when Abby returns, and that will certainly be an interesting show. Part 2. Here we go. Time to talk about the Lost City of Atlantis. I'm sure you've all heard of Lost City of Atlantis, but I will give you a little bit of background on it anyway, just because that's how we do things here. Atlantis was allegedly a super technologically advanced island civilization which existed in the ancient world. Its first mention in literacy came from the famed Greek philosopher Plato in his works Timaeus and Critias. There you go, lots of mentions of Greek words in the show today. We had the Greek Orthodox Church, and now I've got Plato as well. Shout out to all the Greeks listening there for that one. These are written around the year 360 BC, although an exact year is unknown. Why is this relevant? I'll get onto that now. In these writings, Plato claims that a city called Atlantis was swallowed by the sea around the year 10,000 BC, so 12,000 years ago to us now. In Plato's story, Atlantis was a formidable global power in both technology and its military strength. It was described as an antagonist military power that besieged the ancient Athens. Somehow, Athens repelled the attack, and due to their aggression and failings, Atlantis fell out of favour with the Greek gods and was submerged in sea in just one day. Today, the exact location or even the authenticity of the city's existence is unknown, but rumours continue to swirl. I'm sure you knew most of that already, but I mean, you've definitely heard of Atlantis at least, because it's got a huge cultural influence. Atlantis is massive in terms of its cultural presence, much higher than the Philadelphia experiment. It goes without saying for the Rohonc Codex. No one's heard of the Rohonc Codex. Very, very fascinating to read into the backstories of that. So again, our big questions are rising up here. First of all, was Atlantis real? Is the big key question that we will probably, unless we actually find it, we're probably never going to know for sure. Where was Atlantis? We'll be going into that in detail later on in this show. I've got a full section on that. I've had to pinpoint a couple because there is a lot of speculation about its location, so I've only picked a couple. If I did all of them, I'd be here all night talking to you about them and their respective theories. And what would it mean for us if Atlantis was real? Of course, it would have huge repercussions. Of course, it was meant to be it was meant to be technologically advanced beyond our understanding or their understanding at the time. So where is this technology and how do they manage to achieve it? It would completely disrupt our idea of human evolution's progress in terms of technology. It would be massive if we could do that. But of course, actually finding the city is step one. Knowing where it could be. Now, knowing where it could be is step one. Finding it is step two. And then maybe seeing about the evidence of super advanced technology is a potential step three. But we'll go on to that in a bit. Let's have a little talk about Plato quickly. I didn't think you'd be getting an ancient history lesson today. Haha, you were wrong. Plato was born between 428 BC and 423 BC. Remember in BC, the years go back to front. So the bigger the name, the bigger the year, the further away it is. Just remember that. So he was born between 428 and 423 BC and was a famed Athenian philosopher who was keenly interested in ethics, politics, theories of knowledge, literature and society, among other areas. All in all, a very brainy guy and has achieved a lot. Well, I mean, you don't get remembered for 1600 years for not being intelligent, do you? He clearly knew what he was talking about. One of his most notable pieces of work, Timaeus, is one of the key sources of information regarding early scriptures on Atlantis. The story of Atlantis came to be known by Plato for it being passed down through family generations, leading back to his great-grandfather. His great-grandfather, Dropidas, heard the story from famous Athenian lawmaker Solon, who in turn heard it from an Egyptian sanctuary. You already know what I'm going to say about this one. It's a big concern. It's a big thing that we mentioned on the show last week, and that is the word of mouth thing and the change of how time can affect your memory. So the Egyptian sanctuary may have had a story originally about this, and then it is passed on to Solon, who, by the way, died in the year 560 BC, which is 130 years before Plato was born. So that's already a massive gap to be carrying a story by word of mouth. And then through that, it is carried through Plato's great-grandfather, his grandfather, his father, and then Plato. So he could be hearing the 6th hand-me-down version of this story, and literally anything could have changed about it over that time. And it's worth mentioning 560 BC. Of course, that is still a long way off of 10,000 BC, which again shows that where did that story of the Egyptian sanctuary come from? That we will sadly never know, of course. But that is the origins of the Atlantis story. Yeah, so like I just mentioned, doubts can be cast here as Atlantis could merely be a result of historic Chinese whispers. After passing through so many years and generations as nothing more than a tale or word of mouth, it gave people and time plenty of opportunity to alter the story and change it either willingly or unwillingly. Or not willingly, what's the word I'm looking for there? Consciously is the word I'm looking for there. So they could unconsciously change it by not remembering certain aspects of the story right, or consciously changing it by purposely changing the narrative and various other aspects of the story to suit what they thought would be better, or to suit them in any way. So there's that bit there. And historians also claim that Plato used the Atlantis invasion of Athens as an analogy to show Plato's idea of a state system-run country being strong and superior. Of course, like I mentioned, Plato was big on politics. He liked that a lot. And in his book, The Republic, he talked about that. He's talked about his vision of like a state-run country. Basically, the idea is the Athens invasion was an analogy for that, and how Athens, when run as a city-state, or a polis, as it was called in Old Greek language, was superior and strong and sort of unbeatable in a way. On top of this, historians also reject the existence of Atlantis and say its mentioning in Plato's work was merely him inventing the nation as an example to help reiterate his ideas. Again, this relates back to the idea of him using it as an example to bolster the idea of the state-run country being efficient and being strong and unified. There are also theories that Plato drew loose inspiration from the Athenian invasion on Sicily in 415 BC to 413 BC to make the invasion story, and he may have also drawn influence from the city of Helic. I think I've pronounced that right. Helic or Heliki is spelled Helike, so he-like, basically. I think it's Helic. He drew influence from Helic for the destruction of Atlantis. So let's talk about Helic quickly, because that might not be a name you're familiar with. It certainly wasn't one I was familiar with until I started the research for today's show. This was an ancient Greek city-state, or a polis, as we recently mentioned, that was submerged by a tsunami in 373 BC. In 2004, it was listed as an endangered site after it was rediscovered in 1994. People argue that a similar fate could have fallen upon Atlantis, and if it was submerged by water as the tale suggests, then a tsunami would be the most plausible cause of this. Of course, the Greeks were very religious. They had their Greek gods that they believed in, and the belief was in Plato's work that Poseidon himself had destroyed Atlantis out of rage and his dissatisfaction with them invading Athens. Of course, there's no historical documentation of Athens being invaded by Atlantis. If there was, we couldn't really argue the fact that Atlantis existed. So you've got that bit there about Plato maybe drawing influence from Helic. But the thing is that there's archaeological evidence of Helic and no solid evidence whatsoever to suggest the existence of Atlantis. This is the big issue here. Just with Helic, we have found outlines of buildings, historical documentation of it, and even coins from the excavation sites on the city. In a similar comparison, only some historical nautical maps, Plato's work and speculation suggest Atlantis may have been real. We'll talk about that a little bit more later, but we'll go on to the potential locations now. So potential locations for Atlantis. The descriptions and potential locations of Atlantis differ wildly and leave much of this so-called evidence to reader interpretation. Like, there's not really, there's no way of us knowing what is historical hoaxes, what is misinterpreted, what is sort of, like I said, historical Chinese whispers. There's no way of sort of deterring that from old nautical maps. There could be errors on the map as well. Like, I talk about maps, there's, obviously I can't show you, but there is an old map with an island called Isle Atlantis on there. And there's multiple maps, actually, featuring a place called Atlantis on there, which is very interesting. It shows that there may well have been a place called Atlantis, whether this was the fabled super technologically advanced Atlantis we're referring to. Or maybe it was a name for a different city that is since renamed. Maybe, I know there's an Atalanta in Italy, which is a similar name, and then Cadiz in Spain also used to have an old name. And we'll go on to the northern Spain in a little bit, but they're sort of examples of how cities can change their names. And through word of mouth, those old names could have been re-derived into Atlantis. But of course we don't know that. And there is, in fact, as many as 27 suggested locations that could possibly have been the site of Atlantis if it existed. These locations are spread across the world, with places such as the Bahamas, Antarctica, and even the coast of Great Britain being suggested as places. However, for this, I've picked 3 of the most covered and speculated places for the location of Atlantis. So let's go straight into that. Already mentioned Cadiz in Spain, so the first of the 3 we're going to mention is northern Spain. This theory originates from a man named Jorge Maria Ribeiro Menezes. So, another long name. If you're going to be a historian, can you please have a shorter name, just so where people like me in hundreds of years' time, producing whatever their equivalent of a podcast is, can say your name more easily. Jorge Maria Ribeiro Menezes. Yeah, Jorge. Jorge claims that Atlantis is the underwater plateau off the coast of Spain known as the Ladanois Bank. These claims originated from the idea that this area was part of the continental drift, that broke off around 12,000 years ago as a result of the last ice age. The continental drift was, of course, the big tectonic movement, and the Danois Bank, which is spelled Danois, just in case I'm not pronouncing that right and you want to research this yourself afterwards. His argument says that the tectonic activity would have created tsunami waves hundreds of meters high that could have annihilated Atlantis in a day, much like the historical claims suggest. Like every theory we've discussed so far on the show today with the Rohonc Codex and now Atlantis 2, criticism of this theory is widespread. However, the most notable evidence against this comes from detailed geological studies of the bank. Studies show that the area was indeed affected by tectonic activity, but in the opposite fashion suggested by Jorge Ribeiro. Studies show that the area was created by a thrust rather than catastrophic tsunami, meaning it was formed by upward motion from the tectonics as opposed to downward. So this basically stamps out any possibility of it being that particular spot near northern Spain. I mean, it could be, there are rumours that the city of Cadiz itself was Atlantis. Something that would definitely be worth looking into, but of course I've only got a certain amount of time on the show. I want to cover as many ideas as I possibly can within that time frame. So now we've got our second of the 3 theories, which is the Azores Islands. Now, I wasn't too familiar with these. I don't really know a whole lot about them. It's only research for this that I've discovered them. Yeah, they do seem quite nice places, in fairness. But apart from that, I'm going holiday mode on you, so... But yeah, I'm not here to sell you a holiday, I'm just here to talk about the theory. The Azores Islands are a group of islands owned by Portugal, which are around 900 miles off the Portuguese coast. So that's quite a distance. Theorists have previously suggested that these islands are the mountain tops of Atlantis. The most notable of these theories was Ignatius L. Connolly, a great easy name for me to pronounce, 49 minutes into a fully word-spoken show. I cannot feel my face at this point. I've done so much talking. Yeah, Ignatius L. Connolly was an American congressman from 1863 to 1869. Connolly wrote an entire book about the folklore surrounding Atlantis and included this location theory in his book, The Antediluvian World. Hey, I did it. How about that? Had absolutely no reason to be scared. So in his book, Atlantis, The Antediluvian World, Ignatius L. Connolly suggested that the Azores Islands the Azores Islands, were the mountaintops of Atlantis after it had been submerged. However, on the back of this research, years later, a French geologist named Pierre-Marie Termier, who was born in 1859, was quoted as saying, and this is his exact quote, by the way, that the entire region north of the Azores, and perhaps the very region of Azores of which they may be only visible ruins, was very recently submerged. This basically backs up what Ignatius was saying. This is very big stuff, basically. the region of Azores, which they may only be visible ruins. That is a very key word here. His research showed that he thought an area of roughly 40,000 square miles. To put that into perspective, that is how big Iceland is. An island the size of Iceland was submerged over 10,000 feet below the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. That seems absolutely phenomenal that an island that big could just sink. Almost impossible, you could argue, which is what's the word I'm looking for? I'll say the doubt. The skepticism is the word I was looking for. Is the skepticism surrounding this theory comes from. Later reports contradicted this, however, as researchers proved that the islands are volcanic islands and are not remnants of a large continental mass. So again, you can put a big red line through the Azores Islands. Unfortunately, it had a little bit of momentum there when the French guy came in and backed up Ignatius, but no, apparently not. Now, I thought I would do this one last. In recent years, anyway, it has become almost unified as an acceptance of that this was Atlantis by conspiracy theorists. And this is, of course, the Reikat structure, or the Eye of the Sahara as it is known. The Eye of the Sahara is a rock formation in the Sahara Desert in Mauritania containing rocks that predate existing evidence of life on Earth. So it's very old. The Eye of the Sahara is a blue circular shape that is actually visible from space and is used as a visual landmark for astronauts. This is fascinating because the Eye of the Sahara, to my knowledge, not as many people know about this as they should really. It's quite an underappreciated landmark. I feel like tourism-wise it's quite protected because, well, it's in the middle of a desert. It's very hard to get to. So it's not really under threat from that. I mean, climate change might be threatening it in some way, but I can't confirm nor deny that as I don't really have enough knowledge to support it either way. Studies show that all the rocks are Earth-based, ruling out the idea that the Eye is an impact crater from a meteor, and it is at least 100 million years old and is completely unique as far as we know. It is quite extraordinary. I recommend you go on Google Images and type in Eye of the Sahara. It is fascinating looking at this. It's absolutely stunning. The idea that this is a real thing is amazing. It is really quite exceptional. Of course, somewhere as fascinating as this is going to get lots of coverage, but doesn't seem to for some reason, which is quite odd. But it is very nice and it is very appealing, and I do definitely recommend that you go look at pictures of the Eye of the Sahara. There's lots of articles about it which are fun to read. So speculation about the Eye has been common, but it wasn't until quite recently, very recently in fact, just last year in 2018, that a large-scale investigation into the Eye's link with the Atlantis was made. A YouTube channel named Bright Inside highlighted the similarities between the stories of Atlantis, of the geographical formation and structure of the Eye. Again, that's already making people go, oh, maybe there's a bit of weight to this story, but it gets better. So, for example, Solon, who we mentioned earlier, for one of the people who eventually passed his story of Atlantis all the way down the generations to Plato, when it made its way into his works, he described Atlantis as having 5 concentric circles, which is the same amount featured in the Eye. It also includes a site that could have been a waterway to the south, matching Solon's description. Again, this is such a big coincidence, isn't it? Like 2 back-to-back like that, but it keeps going. The similarities carry on. A 23.5 kilometre diameter, mountain sheltering the city to the north. These are also both things that were loosely mentioned by Solon. Of course, the exact measurements we don't know, but that is roughly the size we could have expected Atlantis to be. The mountain sheltering the city to the north, much like was explained by Plato. Lakes and rivers were also once present across the Sahara many, many years ago. This is again supporting the idea that it may have been on water. There could have been a city there on water, on the Reikat structure, or perhaps the Reikat structure itself is remains of Atlantis. Like I said, the Reikat structure is over 100 million years old. Atlantis is rumoured to have been destroyed 10,000 years ago. I mean, the fact the Reikat structure itself is Atlantis is unlikely, but it could have been Atlantis could have been built on it, is a suggestion here. You've got a nice little insight there, and like I said, the rivers and lakes were once present across Sahara, but changing water levels may have caused a potential Atlantis to re-emerge from its watery grave over the course of thousands of years. That may seem unplausible, but here is an undeniable fact. If you believed absolutely nothing else on the show today, you cannot deny this. A gradual rise of land at the rate of 2.5 centimetres a year would put the Eye of the Sahara underwater 12,000 years ago. So there you go. It was underwater 12,000 years ago. Genuinely, there is so much evidence on this. It is quite remarkable that it's taken this long for people to make this link for it, really. I'm quite baffled that nobody considered the Eye of the Sahara as the Atlantis beforehand. But there you go. It is very interesting to consider that. That's the end of my notes, so I'm guessing that means it's the end of the show. You will not believe how quick an hour goes when you're just sitting in a studio talking to yourself. That has gone so quickly. My throat is very dry now. I'm not going to deny that. It's not quite as dry as the Eye of the Sahara. Yeah. Oh, my throat. I'm going to need a drink after this. But yes, thank you for tuning in. That is the end of the show. I'm very glad you all came along and joined me once again for the second episode of the Conspiracy Crunch. We discussed the Rohonc Codex at the beginning of the show and followed that with the Lost City of Atlantis. I hope they both interested you. We'll be running polls on our Facebook page afterwards to see what your beliefs are on the legitimacy of the Rohonc Codex and also likely places of where Atlantis would have existed. Make sure you tune in next week at the same time and the same place to catch episode 3 of the Conspiracy Crunch. Like I mentioned at the top of the show, we will be talking about Kapustin Yar as the first half of the show, as the pre-chosen one, and then you are welcome to go onto our Facebook page and vote in our poll to decide the second subject, which this week is between the potential murder of Alexander the Great by his own army, of course, famed commander of military. Even today, his tactics are studied by military experts and perhaps one of the greatest military leaders in history. And the second option is the secret Sphinx rooms, which is it's riveting looking into that, actually. It's basically that I have a photo on the Facebook page, actually, of the first aerial photo of the Sphinx, and there is quite a distinct hole in the top of the Sphinx. There are also rumours of excavators who first discovered the Sphinx finding stairways and corridors and openings in the Sphinx going to rooms underneath it. So we'll be talking about, if that one wins, which, if I'm honest, last I checked, it had 81% of the votes, so that's probably happening. We'll be looking into possibility that there is a room underneath the Sphinx, what its purpose may be, and if there's still going to be anything of interest in there, and also, above all, with the complications with actually going there and finding it. Anyway, that is the end of the show. Thank you very much for tuning in. My name is Aaron Chandler. I'll be back same time, same place next week with Abby sitting by my side once again, and it will be a great show, I can guarantee you that now. So once again, come along with your mind open and see what happens. Until next week, I'll see you later. 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 Later.